So, Jim, jumping right in, what exactly is a case interview? It's an interview focused on solving a problem that's provided to you by your interviewer. Depending on the firm you're interviewing with, it may be a little bit more industry specific, but typically you're going to see some general business problems. And what it's meant to do is simulate a real environment in the consulting workplace. The questions and the case that you'll get, again, will be a general business strategy case, most likely, and what that case will effectively do is provide an insight into how you think that your interviewer will then be able to use and analyze whether or not you'd be a fit. It also provides you as a way of really seeing whether or not you'd be a fit. Part of the interviewing process is, of course, whether or not you see yourself aligning with that firm and with their interests and their focus. But specifically on the interviewer side, it provides a way for them to measure, again, both fit and personality. You'll notice that in this workshop, we'll discuss a few frameworks, we'll discuss a few strategies, but the most important thing when case interviewing is to find your own style. There's a million different frameworks, a million different strategies. But the most important thing is for you to sound authentic and to really nail the personality element of it. Really, your casing is a way of shining and showing who you really are. Next slide. So again, covering what cases test, and we're going to fly through this so we can get some practice. Interviewers are really testing your ability to think logically, ask any clarifying questions, structure a problem, and do some quick math. Again, they're also looking at personality and fit and whether or not you'd be a fit for their company. They don't test industry knowledge. They don't trust whether or not you've done 6 or 7 accounting classes or whether or not you are a stats major. Really, again, what they're looking for is fit and your ability to break down a problem. Again, they want to see how your brain thinks. So oftentimes you might stop yourself in a case, and if you don't know the immediate answer to it or don't know where to start, oftentimes it's best to just say, I don't know the immediate answer, but here's how I think about this. And that might help you get to the answer. Next slide. So there's a few different types of case interviews, and we're going to focus on 2 today. First are estimation or market sizing cases, as well as interviewee-led cases. At different firms and in different industries, you might see other types of case interviews, like brain teasers, interviewer-led, as well as written case or group cases. But today in this workshop, we're going to be focusing on the 2 most common types of cases, which are your market sizing case or your interviewee-led case. So jumping into market sizing and estimation cases, these are really your bread and butter when it comes to most initial case interviews. You might see this especially in your first round interview. And market sizing cases are either going to be a case in and of themselves, meaning the case is dedicated solely to market sizing, or they might be a component of a larger case. And that's something that if you see a second or a final round, you're more likely to see market sizing become part of a case and not just the case itself. They're meant to test math on the fly, again, back of the envelope math. And in order to succeed in market sizing cases, you need to find ways to make it easier for yourself to do that math. And we're going to cover a few benchmarks today that will help make quick math easier for you in your market sizing. A key part and a key element of a market sizing case is to pick your metric using those benchmarks, right? And we'll cover exactly what that means once we start doing some practices, and we'll start showing you exactly what an example looks like. At the beginning of the market sizing case and throughout, you're going to be listing and stating assumptions. And again, we'll cover what that means. And they're based on the idea that you're really looking to make this as easy as possible for yourself and for your interviewer to follow. For example, we'll cover this in a second, but if you have the population of the United States, instead of using 320 million, you might round to 300 million. If you're given 148, you might round that to 150. While you're interviewing, an important element of the market sizing case, and any case interview generally, is to walk your interviewer through your work and also how you're thinking. So when you state your assumption, it's important to explain why you're doing those assumptions, if there's a reason behind it. And at the end of the case and throughout your case, make sure that you're checking your numbers. For example, if you're looking at the market size of a movie theaters in the United States, right? Of movies in the United States, you're probably looking at the billions, not the millions, right? Or the trillions. So make sure that as you go through a case that you're revising and making sure that those numbers seem right. So here are a few basic benchmarks. Again, you'll notice how rounding can be used to make your life easier. So for US population, you can use 300 million. US number of households, roughly 100 million. Average life expectancy, around 80. Average size of US household, 2.6. You can run the 2.5. The working population is roughly 50%, and the world population is 7 billion. I would take a picture of this. And then on top of this, I would also make sure that, for example, if you're interviewing with a firm whose office the office you're interviewing with is in San Francisco or DC, I would also look up some basic benchmarks for that city. You might get a case related to the office that you're interviewing in. So, for example, if you're interviewing with an office in DC, it's good to know the population of DC, some general facts and figures related to DC and any other city you might be interviewing with. Again, basic math. You want to make this as easy as possible for you. So please feel free to take, and use back of the envelope calculations and round when necessary. You won't be pulling out your calculator during a case interviewer. And the idea is for you to be able to show your interviewer how you can execute and make math easier for yourself. So we're going to start out with some practice. And again, these are market sizing and estimation cases. And what market sizing questions and cases are asking you to do is determine the size of a particular market or industry. And that's most commonly defined as the total amount of sales in dollar value of a product or service or in 1 year. That's usually a clarifying question that you might want to ask at the start of your interview. Basically, clarifying by market size, are you looking for the total dollar value or the total amount of a product or service in a year? Again, they could be asking for either dollar or unit value. So you want to make sure that you're asking that clarifying question and getting that right off the bat. Market sizing questions, as you can see in these two examples here, often have a geographical element to them. So for example, in the first question that we're going to cover today, how many houses in Georgetown? So that's defining what the geography that we're looking at is. And in the second question, we're looking at the market size of toothbrushes in the United States, not globally, not in North America. And again, these are both market sizing questions. The first is more of an estimation case. And this is where we start to sort of delve into the interactive element of today's workshop. So I'm going to start off by sort of tackling that first question. And I'm going to, as I think about that first question, I'm going to ask for hands and basically just take, comments and ideas from folks in the audience. So we can kind of work through the case together, just like you would with your interviewer. So our first case here is how many houses in Georgetown are occupied by Georgetown undergraduate students? The first step of any case interview first is to understand that you actually understand the question. So let's say, for example, that Allie was my interviewer. The first step after being told the prompt by Allie would be to repeat back the prompt with my own understanding of it. So if Allie were to say, Avi, how many houses in Georgetown are occupied by Georgetown undergraduate students? I would say, great. Thank you, Allie, for walking me through the question just to make sure I understand everything. We've been asked to identify how many houses in the Georgetown neighborhood are occupied by Georgetown undergraduate students. Before jumping into the case, I have a few clarifying questions that I want to ask to ensure that I'm getting to the core of what we're looking to solve. At this point, I'm actually going to ask for some hands. For this question, it's really straightforward, but there might be some clarifying questions that will help us get to a more precise number. So if you have any ideas as to how we can sort of refine this question and make sure that we're getting to the core of the information, please raise your hand. I see James Powell. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Sure. I would look to clarify if we're counting university-owned townhouses that are in the neighborhood or whether it's just people who are renting privately.
Perfect. Great question. Great clarifying question. And I think it's really applicable to this question. So for the case of this case, we're going to include both university-owned and non-university owned houses in the Georgetown neighborhood. I'll give it another second for any more clarifying questions here. Again, for this case, there's two main elements in it, or three really. First, houses, um, Georgetown, meaning the geographical area, and then Georgetown undergraduate students. So one clarifying question. Oh, Sydney.
Yeah, another question you could ask when you say the geographic region of Georgetown, is that including the common neighborhoods around Georgetown, the university, like Burleith, Foxhall, etc., or is this just including West Georgetown?
Great question. Exactly what I was looking for. For this case, we're going to include all three, so West Georgetown, Burleith, and Foxhall. And instead of tackling this question on my own, what I would love to see is some hands as to what those assumptions are going to be for us to be able to calculate this case. Again, for those that are new to consulting and new to case interviewing, to tackle this problem, we're going to have to make some assumptions as to one, how many houses, how many Georgetown undergraduate students live in houses, how many are eligible, exactly how many houses there might be in the Georgetown neighborhood. Again, you're going to have to make some assumptions to get to the core of this case. And just like in any case interviewer, there are multiple ways of getting to the answer. So your strategy might be different from someone else's. So kicking it off, are there any initial assumptions that folks think we should be making to try to answer this case? I'll start us off with one, right? So we have the Georgetown total undergraduate population, right? For this case, I want to start with a top-down approach. Usually for any case, you have two options. You can go top-down, meaning you start with the largest possible population. So you start with your largest possible number, and then look to refine it and break it down. So for example, in this case, we would start with the total Georgetown undergraduate population, then see how many are eligible to live off campus, then how many would actually choose to live off campus, and then finally, how many are choosing to live in the individual, in West Georgetown, Burleith, and Foxhall. The opposite would be to do a bottom-up approach, which is where you start with a small number and build and increase it up by sort of refining and including the population that you're answering this question. For this case, it's the best approach, I would argue, is definitely top-down. And working through the Georgetown undergraduate population would be my approach. So I'm going to start off. Georgetown undergraduate population is roughly 6,000. And my first assumption is going to be that most seniors are going to live off campus. And since we're including both university-owned and non-university-owned houses, I'm going to say roughly 90% of the senior class lives off campus. Then my second assumption is going to be juniors. Of the juniors, I would say it's less likely for a junior to live off campus. However, there is like the junior exemption. So I will say perhaps 10% of the junior class lives off campus using their junior exemption, right? Or in a university townhouse. With that, I guess, with those initial assumptions, are there any other assumptions that folks can think about for this question?
It also matters the size of the houses.
Yes, great point.
How many people can fit into each house?
Exactly. That's another assumption we're going to have to make, right? Because the numbers that we're working with so far, the assumptions that we've sort of built into our case and brought to life are all individual students, but most students don't have their own houses themselves. So we're going to have to figure out roughly what is the average amount of residents per house in Georgetown. So that's a great point. Bakita?
Yeah, I had a general question about this, this type of question. So for the assumptions that we are making, say, like, to what extent can we ask the interviewer for the answer. So say like I don't know how many undergraduate students there are. Do we just make a broad assumption at that point, or can we ask? And what sort of question? And if we can ask, what sort of questions are we allowed to? And what would be too like pushing the limits a little bit?
Absolutely, great question. And so for that, what I would say is, let's say in this example, I don't know the Georgetown undergraduate population, right? Let's say I don't know it's 6,000. But what I do know is that most universities similar to Georgetown's size are between 5 and 10,000. So when I received this case in the clarifying questions portion, as I'm working through my assumptions, I can tell Ali, my interviewer, I'm actually not 100% sure how many undergraduate students there are at Georgetown. But what I do know is that comparable universities of similar sizes range from 5 to 10,000. Can you give me a more accurate number that represents the Georgetown undergraduate population? You can do the same thing with any city. You can do the same thing with any country or of a similar industry, right? You know, they're not, again, the goal of a case interviewer, they're not trying to stump you. They're not trying to, they're not trying to mess you up. They want you to succeed in the case. And most, most firms, most good firms, most great firms will help you work through the case process. So great question. So we've got a few assumptions in place. Can someone just remind me what those assumptions are that we've sort of mentioned so far? I believe we have 3 so far. So I'll cover them really quickly. Where assumptions built in so far into this case that we've brought sort of to life are: 1, seniors, roughly 90% of the senior class is going to live off campus. So again, these assumptions are based on eligibility and what population is actually living off campus. We said 90% of the senior class. We said roughly 10% of the junior class. We also brought in the question of how many students actually live in each house. Most houses are between 4 and 8. In this case, for this case, you can make an argument for the number to be 4. You can make the argument for the number to be 6. The most important thing is that you're arguing why you think a number is correct. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and say 6. I would argue that most West Georgetown and Burleaf townhouses are 6 people. Some are 8, some are 4, but ultimately the average, the median should fall around 6. So I'm going to use that number 6 per house for this case. Then we also have the total Georgetown undergraduate population being 6,000. So now that we have these assumptions in place, we're going to start working through the math, right? Step number 1 is going to be calculating what percentage of our total undergraduate population is living off campus. And that's where our assumptions come in. 90% of the senior class and 10% of the junior class. Assuming a 25% proportion for each of the classes, that means that roughly 1,500 are in each class. We said 90% of the senior class. That's going to be roughly 1,350 are living off campus. For the junior class, that's 10% of 1,500 for the junior class is 150. So we've got 150 juniors and 1,350 seniors living off campus. Add those two together, we've got 1,500 students total living off campus in off-campus houses, right? The next step is to take that number and divide it by 6, which is the total, the average number of students in each house. You divide 1,500 by 6, and that will give you your total number of houses in Georgetown. Does anyone want to do that math for me? Put you guys on the spot. Some quick maths. Leo.
Yeah, 1,500 divided by 6 is the same thing as 500 divided by 3, which is 166.
Perfect. That's exactly how you want to be tackling these problems. You want to find ways to make this math as easy as possible for you. So there's, again, a variety of different strategies that you can employ to make math easier for you. And what I would really recommend as you gear up your case prep, to do quick math problems and find ways that work for you to make math easier for you. The next case that we're going to tackle, I'm going to try to make even more interactive than this last one, which is to find the total market size of toothbrushes in the United States. My goal for this case is to effectively just guide the interview and have the interviewees be you. So what I'm going to do is basically pose the question, and from start to finish, I would love folks in the audience to raise their hands and go through the case process together. Again, starting with repeating the case back with your understanding of it, asking any clarifying questions, making assumptions, and driving an answer. So our case today is our client has asked us to find the total market size of toothbrushes in the United States. How would you approach this problem? Can someone repeat the case back to me with their understanding of it and in their own words?
Can I ask a question first?
Good.
So for the unit of market size, is it always in dollars or should it be in the unit of the good we're talking about?
Great question. So that's a question that you asked in the clarifying portion, the clarifying question portion of your case. So in this case, if we ask our interviewer, he or she will give us an answer on whether it's the dollar value or the unit value. So step one here would be to repeat the case back, make sure that you got all the necessary information, and then proceed with your clarifying questions, which is when you would introduce that question. I'm going to get us started by repeating the case back, and then we'll have folks ask some clarifying questions. So our client has hired us to conduct a market analysis of the total toothbrush market size in the United States. I have a few clarifying questions I'd like to ask first. Is that okay? Sure. Anyone have any clarifying questions they'd like to ask at this point? Think about what variables do we have here? We have market size is 1. What does that mean? How do we capture that? 2, toothbrushes. What are toothbrushes? What do we include in that category? And the United States. Are we looking at any geographic area? Are we looking at some individual states, regions, etc.? Bakita.
I'm not sure if this is something to ask, but is this question asking for like yearly market value or size, or is it like the total market value of the entire industry?
Yeah.
Because maybe that would change.
Absolutely a question you asked. Typically, when you get a case like this, it's referring to the annual market size. So again, like the annual value, either in unit or dollars for that industry or of that product or of that service, right? So your interviewer, in this case me, would answer, we're looking at the annual market size in units, not dollars for this case. Any other additional clarifying questions? So that covers our first variable. We've asked a clarifying question on our first variable, which is market size. We have toothbrushes and the United States.
Are we including the traditional ones and also the electronic ones?
Great question. That's exactly what I was looking for on the toothbrushes side. So for this case, we're going to exclude electronic toothbrushes. So this is just going to be your standard toothbrush throwaway every X amount of time. At least we hope folks are throwing them away. Great. So for United States, we're just going to go ahead and assume that it's referring to all 50 states and no particular region. And we're going to start tackling this problem. So now that we've asked our clarifying questions, we know that the market size is referring to the unit, the total amount of units sold in a year. And we know toothbrushes are referring to we'll call it standard toothbrushes, throw away after an X amount of time. So your plastic toothbrushes in the United States. So now that we have our clarifying questions, we're going to ask our interviewer, in this case me, for some time to build a framework to tackle this problem, right? So let's start sort of thinking about how we would tackle this problem, right? What assumptions are we building in? What do we need to sort of assume? What do we need answers to? What do we need to find a number for this? And I'm posing this as a question to everyone. How can we get a number value for the number of toothbrushes sold in a year in the US? JP.
Yeah, we're gonna need to know the population size of the United States and how many of those people use toothbrushes, and then also how frequently each person on average goes through one toothbrush.
Perfect. So let's repeat those. Population size of the US, which we have earlier from our benchmarks, which is 300 million. What was your next one, JP?
How frequently a person uses up a toothbrush, like twice a year, once a year, it does depend.
Any other assumptions? Okay. I would agree. So I think, of course, we're going to start with the total population size of the US. And this case, you can make an argument for either a top-down or a bottom-up approach. You can start with the individual, see how many toothbrushes do I use in a year, and then work your way up using that information. Or you could start with the US population, see how many people actually brush their teeth. Let's say 95% of the population, who knows? How often they're brushing their teeth, and how many toothbrushes they're using up, exactly like JP said. And the assumptions you'll have to make and the arguments you'll have to make are, one, how often do toothbrushes get thrown out, right? You need to argue in your case interview why you think that toothbrushes are getting thrown out every 3 months instead of every 6 months, right? And that's where you really see the value in a case interview. It's not just, finding what I think case interviews really show is that you don't need to be an accounting major or a global business major. You could be in any major and be able to think and break down a problem in a case interview. So we're going to pause there. We've used up a lot of time on these market sizing cases. We're going to move on through the rest of the workshop. But again, feel free to pause and ask any questions. We've got folks that have past background and experience in consulting, folks that don't. So feel free to stop and ask any questions. Judy.
Yes, I do have a question about the assumptions that we make. So for example, if we assume that we throw away one toothbrush a month, and if the interviewer asks us why are we making this assumption, what would you say to be a good response? So would you think maybe like according to my personal experience, because I feel like that wouldn't be sufficient.
Yeah, absolutely. So for a case like this, right, your personal experience is really what you're going to have to rely on, right? And in a lot of cases like this, your personal experience will really drive your answer, right? So it's the way that you craft your experience and the way that you craft your argument that really matters, right? So in this case, for example, let's say that I was arguing that, how would I make that assumption, right? In my house and the way that, my parents taught me, my siblings do it, every month we throw out and totally hit the refresh on all of our toothbrushes. You could also, so for example, DeJorn just asked me, see if you refer. Oh, that's a private question. I'll get to that in a second. For this question, your personal experience is really what you have to rely on. So it's a matter of really crafting your argument and explaining and rationalizing why you think that way. It's not like we can pull a study. It's not like we can sort of reference something that is provided to us, unless you do for some reason have that background. So DeJordan actually asked a helpful question in private chat, whether or not we can refer to findings across studies that we've read in class or studies that we've seen outside. And that's totally an option here. If you have some past professional background or a past interest in the industry that you're covering in a case or a product that you're covering, absolutely bring those in. And it's definitely helpful. It shows how you're able to drive your assumptions based on what you've encountered in the workspace or outside. Next slide. So as we've kind of gone through and shown in the past few examples, there's pretty much a script or a structure that you follow during interviews, right? First, the prompt, repeating back the prompt, summarizing it in your own words, and ensuring that you have all the information you need, right? Oftentimes a case might be 2 sentences like the ones you've seen so far. Sometimes it might be 6 or 7, right? Especially in an in-person case or in an online case, you might have difficulties hearing or understanding what your interviewer said. It's really important to make sure that you get all of the problems, all of the elements of that case at the very beginning. That second point there is also really important, right? When we get to the interviewer-led or the interviewee-led cases, oftentimes there's going to be objectives or information that isn't revealed in the initial prompt. And that's where you're clarifying questions. That's where you asking, are there any other objectives that the company that we're, consulting for that matter for this case, right? Next step, asking for some time to organize your thoughts and your approach. That's where you build and present your assumptions. 4, presenting those framework, presenting those assumptions and explaining, how you got to those assumptions and what your arguments for them are, and how they drive you to an answer. In that step, you're walking your interviewer through the math itself. Not, one common mistake in case interviewers is after you present your framework is, let me take a few minutes to get to a final number for you. That's a missed opportunity. That's time that you can use to show and explain how the assumptions that you built affect your number. And just as we did earlier, when we looked at the Georgetown population in off-campus houses, you can walk your interviewer through the assumptions while you do the math. And that takes a little bit of practice, and that's where case prep is really important. And finally, conclusion and presenting your recommendations at the conclusion of the case. Any questions on the script, any questions on the structure, most cases will fall into this structure.
How much time, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, how much time do we usually have for one case interview?
Great question. So most firms will do between 20 to 30 minutes. Okay. Awesome. Let's jump to the next slide. So moving on to the next example, which is the interviewee-led case. This is a little bit more advanced, a little trickier than your market sizing case. Again, it's the same structure, just a few more steps and a little bit longer, right? And this is where your framework really matters. For your market sizing case, there really are 2 frameworks, right? You can think of it that way. Top down, bottom up. Do you start with the largest population and work your way down? Or do you start at the individual or at the smallest possible unit and work your way up, right? That could be a person, that could be a company, a university, etc., right? For an interviewee-led case, you'll get more of a business problem. And we'll have a few examples in a few slides. And those kind of questions, these kind of case questions, are a little trickier to answer, right? And that's where frameworks can really help you structure and think about finding a problem. So let's jump on to the next slide. So we're going to give you an example of an interviewee-led case, right? And what exactly does interviewee-led mean? That means that it's up to you to determine a framework. It's up to you to ask clarifying questions. And oftentimes in trickier cases, and usually in your final round, there might be information that is withheld from you that you need to learn and ask to successfully complete a case, or assumptions that need to be made, right? So in this case, we're being asked, in this case, the case is the auto industry is always looking for new ways to innovate. The big US car makers are all looking at getting into the ride sharing service. General Motors is considering investing in Lyft's most recent funding round of $1 billion. GM would receive a seat on GM's board and would be the preferred vehicle provider. Drivers would be allowed to rent GM cars by the day, month, or year. Lyft would be able to source more drivers for its service. Currently, they have to reject many drivers due to the condition of their vehicles. So General Motors invests in this funding round and partner with Lyft. So this kind of case is a lot trickier than, for example, figuring out how many toothbrushes are being sold in the US. And there exist many, many frameworks out there that will help you better understand how you could drive an answer to this kind of question. So let's jump to the next slide. And here are a few examples of those frameworks. And before kind of jumping in,
sorry, I like my computer messed around or whatever, but it jumped like multiple slides. Let's see, this is the other case start, but we decided not to do it. So this would be the framework part, which.
Yes, perfect. Awesome. You want to go ahead and cover that on?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, everyone. Technical difficulties made the handoff not as smooth as I anticipated, but we're working with it. Okay. So yeah, like Javi was saying, you get the case start, you respond by repeating the prompt in your own words, and then you kind of ask your clarifying question. So kind of like the market sizing case. But then this is where it starts to differ a little bit. And where it becomes a little bit more complicated. So what happens next is you ask for a minute or two to structure your thoughts, again, similar, but what you're trying to come up with now is a framework and a hypothesis that's going to guide how you resolve the business problem and, like, I guess, attack it from all of its different points and make sure you cover all your bases so you can understand, like, what exactly is the problem, and then what are we going to have to do to resolve it. So there's two parts to this. The first is the hypothesis. So basically, after you get all of the information, you're going to want to just kind of take us, like, after you organize your thoughts and stuff, you want to begin by presenting your best guess on, like, what you think the problem is. This might not have, you might not have a ton of information on the problem based on the prompt. They could give you a lot of information and you might be able to clearly say, okay, like, the problem is X. Like, for example, the problem is that our costs are increasing, that's making profitability go down, something like that. Or you might be given a business problem, kind of like the one from before, about whether or not, like, GM should invest in, like, Lyft or something like that. And you might say, yeah, my hypothesis right now is that they should. But obviously we're gonna have to, like, go through this problem and figure out, you know, what the main factors are that would enable them to make this kind of decision. This sounds kind of, like, weird because usually you have a lot of evidence to back up a hypothesis and you don't always have evidence at the beginning of a case. But the point of having a hypothesis is so you can show your interviewers that you have structure and a way that you're going to begin attacking the problem, because the whole point of going through the case is trying to verify whether or not your hypothesis is correct. And if it's not, you can, like, adjust it throughout the case. It's fine. You're not wedded to what you say at the beginning, but it's good to have a hypothesis. So after you give the hypothesis, you kind of go into your framework, which, again, we've kind of thrown this word around a lot so far, but basically what it is a way of approaching the problem in a structured manner that kind of thematically organizes all of the pieces you need to consider to come up with a solution to the problem. So that's kind of vague, but an example of this would be, like, imagine that the case you're given is about some company having declining profitability. And then you might think, like, okay, so a framework that would allow me to analyze all of the components I need to understand profitability is one where I look at things related to revenue and I look at things related to cost. And then you would want to look within both of those, like, buckets of things they're called, at subcomponents of each and analyze which of the factors in each bucket might be contributing to the overall profitability decline. So continuing with this example, the problem is profitability. We're going to split it into two major thematic buckets: revenues and costs. And the revenue side, you might want to take a look at, like, if the company offers different products, like what those products are, maybe how they're priced, what the volume of sales is, and things like that to see, like, what the situation is with revenue. On the cost side, you might want to take a look at things like fixed costs and variable costs, and make sure those are in line. And then through analyzing all of the components in each of your thematic buckets, you should be able to cover everything you need to figure out what the problem is and then how you would resolve it by the end of the case. That sounds very vague, but as you practice cases, it will become more apparent like how the structure will allow you to look at everything, and you'll totally be able to do it within 20 to 30 minutes because your interviewer will be guiding you through it as well. Since it's a conversation, you're not just like saying everything all at once. And yeah, the other two notes here. So this thing with turning your paper, you write your framework out on a piece of paper and you're doing like all of the math and stuff on a piece of paper. This would be assuming your interviews are in person, which I don't think they will be, unfortunately, this semester. So it's just something you're going to have, but it's good to keep your paper organized. And you want to make sure all your thematic buckets are MICE, which means mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. What that means is you want to make sure all your thematic buckets kind of the things within them don't overlap between buckets, if that makes sense. And you want to make sure that they're collectively exhaustive so they cover everything that you need to resolve the problem. I know this is like a kind of a complicated topic, so I want to stop here for 2 seconds and see if there are any questions or if that made sense. Cool. Okay. I'm going to cover some basic frameworks really quickly now. So what I will say is I think these can be helpful in a lot of instances. So I'll go through them really quickly, but also you should try and not like cut and paste frameworks in different cases when you get more comfortable with them, because I think 2 things. First is that they don't always work in every case, and so you don't want to just be cutting and pasting. And second is that I think a lot of interviewers really value creativity and contextualization. So if you can make your frameworks, the general frameworks, more specific later on, that's really helpful. But with that being said, kind of a lot of the main ones that get thrown around in the beginning that you might have already seen in some of these like consulting case books are the profitability framework, which I kind of used as an example before. So looking at profit and breaking that problem down to revenues and costs, and then analyzing the things within each bucket. Like I mentioned before, that's the first one. And then we have these other 2, the 4 Ps and the 5 Cs. Those are just like catchy terms for looking at different, components of a problem, whether it's like the price, product, promotion, place, or company cost, competition, consumers or clients and channels, and analyzing which of those like factors, I guess, contributes to the problem the most and how you might want to resolve them. There's other frameworks as well, like Porter's 5 forces and the people, process, and technology frameworks. I won't bore you with reading them all because I'm sure we can all take a look at the screen, but basically all of these just, like I was saying, thematically break down the problem into all of the different like bite-sized chunks that you would need to diagnose what the problem is and figure out how to resolve it. So these are some starting things you can kind of try and incorporate before you add your own little flair. Okay. Javi, I know you wanted to talk about this part.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Allie. So we're going to practice quickly building a framework, and then I'm just going to run through this slide and this framework really quickly. So we have a case about Trident. So Trident is a brand of chewing gum manufactured by Cadbury Adams USA, the US division of British candy giant Cadbury. It's one of the most popular sugar-free chewing gums in the US. It's also sold in the UK and in Canada under the same brand name. And there are a bunch of different popular brands associated with Trident, Trident White, Trident Splash, etc. And so we're a management consultant working for the CEO of Cadbury Adams USA, the manufacturer of Trident, and the CEO of the chewing gum manufacturing company is coming to us and is concerned because his most valuable brand, Trident, is experiencing declining profit margin. And he has 2 questions for us. First, what are the reasons behind their declining profitability? And 2, what are our suggestions for improving their profitability, right? So for this case, we're just going to start off by and really conclude of just building a framework. So if we can quickly go back to those common frameworks, Allie, I want to take some shouts, some hands to see which framework we think might make most sense for a case like this, right? So we're looking at declining profitability, right? Our profit margins are going down in Trident. which of these frameworks, what can we draw, right, from these different frameworks and get an answer to. Ali mentioned earlier how the most important thing is to not, copy and paste, and that is absolutely true. So many folks will go into interviewers and they'll memorize 4 Ps, they'll memorize 4 Cs, and they'll throw these names out. That, again, is robbing you of a chance to show your skill set and your creativity. So with this case in mind, what do we think are some important factors for us to consider? What should be in our framework? Again, framework is a fancy way of just saying, how are we going to get to an answer, right? We don't have any information right now. We don't have a place to start. So let's give ourselves a place to start, so we can start figuring out how to solve this problem. So in this case, since we're looking at profitability of Trident, a good place to start might be with that profit framework, right? A profitability framework, and looking at what makes up profitability, right? So earlier we saw that profit is revenue minus cost, right? And revenue and cost have their own buckets. Can anyone tell me what those buckets are? Basically, what goes into revenue and what goes into cost? JP.
Yeah, revenue would be how much gum or packets of gum you're selling and at what price. And cost would be all the costs associated with making it. And, that includes shipping and, factory costs and all that.
Awesome. And a great way. So you got revenue down 100%, price and volume. Price, what are we selling it at? How many units are we selling? For cost, best way of breaking it down, fixed costs and variable costs. What do we have to spend to run our business? And what can we increase or decrease depending on how many units we want to sell, right? Sometimes selling 1 billion packs of Trident might not be the most profitable, right? Who's going to buy 1 billion packs of Trident? Sometimes reducing the number of units might make more sense from a profitability standpoint, right? Since we're running short on time, I actually just want to go ahead and show you what one framework for this looks like. So if you want to jump to the next slide, Ali. So here's an example of a framework to tackle this question, right? Again, we identified earlier how this is a revenue and a cost problem, right? We haven't identified where the issue is yet. This could be after receiving information from the interviewer. This might be a revenue problem. Maybe we're just not selling enough units anymore. Maybe we have a new competitor that's come in, and they're really, pushing our luck in some markets, right? It might also be a cost thing. Maybe all those different brands that we have, Trident White, Trident Splash, maybe we have just too many costs for these smaller like off brands, if you want to call it that, these smaller segments, these smaller product offerings, right? We don't know that yet. The framework is going to help us structure our questions and structure our attempt to solve this problem, right? So what's our framework for this problem? There's 2 buckets that we care about: revenues and costs, right? Those are the 2 things that make up profitability. Price and volume are the 2 things on the revenue side, and fixed and variable costs are the buckets on the cost side, right? Looking at the left side, we have revenues, price and volume, right? What makes up price? The product mix, the number of products, right? How is price impacted for your standard Trident White versus your like smaller categories of Trident, right? Volume, is volume increasing, decreasing? How do they compare across the different product offerings, right? On the cost side, we have fixed costs and variable costs, right? Again, you can see some of the breakdown there, some of the costs that might be impacted or might be causing a decrease in variability and might be causing an impact in profit margins, right? SG&A, right? Have we made any acquisitions? Are there any new expenses? Are we launching into a new market? Cost of goods sold, right? Have our inputs gone up, right? Is the sugar company that we partner with, have they raised their prices, right? Is there a shortage of some input that we need for our gum, right? Have we increased expenses in marketing and distribution? Has our shipping partner increased prices? There's a million different factors, right? And a framework like this is going to help you ask the questions you need to your interviewer so that you're given the direction, right? And that's where the interviewee led aspect of this comes in, right? So once we build this framework, we can walk through our interviewer, what's going on in our heads, right? So let's say Ali is my interviewer. So Ali, to tackle this problem, I've built a relatively straightforward revenue and cost or profitability framework. On the revenue side, there are two things that matter to us: price and volume. First, looking at price, I want to learn more about how price varies across our product offerings, right? And whether we've increased or decreased price and how it compares to our competitors. Then on the volume front, I want to look at two things. Is volume increasing and decreasing? And how does it compare across our product offerings? On the cost side, fixed and variable costs are of utmost concern. On the variable front, I'm concerned that perhaps recent acquisitions or cost of goods sold might have increased due to X factor, right? Can you give me more information, starting on the price front, on how profitability is impacted by product offering? And that's how you kick off your case. Jumping into part 3 and the conclusion of our workshop. You want to go ahead, Ali?
Sorry, did not know what's going on with the computer, but okay, yeah. So you run the framework by the interviewer, you kind of go through the case, you probably do some math in there, good stuff, normal stuff. And then at the end, they'll say something that kind of like signals that it's the end of the case. And it sounds like kind of silly because they'll be like, we are talking to the CEO of Trident or whatever company tomorrow. Like, what are you going to tell them? And so then you say, okay, can I just have like a 30 seconds to pull together my thoughts? And then they'll give it to you. And you just do quickly, like, this is why it's helpful to have really good notes on your paper and also make sure they're very organized, because at this point in the case, you want to be able to look at everything you've like accomplished so far with all your analysis and pick out like a couple numbers or insights that you think are really helpful in coming to your recommendation. And then in 30 seconds to a minute, you want to say like 3 things basically for your recommendation. So first, you want to say like what action you think they should take. Then you want to say a risk associated with doing that action, and then something you could do to like mitigate that risk in the future. So for example, like with the Trident one, maybe you found out that like labor costs a lot and that's why the profitability is declining. So your recommendation at the end could be, okay, like I recommend that we lay off a bunch of people so that our profit margin increases. A risk associated with that is that maybe everyone will be super mad that we are firing them, and that could hurt our brand. So to mitigate that risk, we should give people like good compensation packages for being laid off so that they aren't going around and like blasting us on social media. That was like kind of a silly example, but that's the kind of structure you want to go through when you're giving your recommendation, so that it shows that you've given like the thought, like a thought to the benefits and the risks associated with what you recommend. And then you'd want to kind of use some of the data you've come throughout the case to support that recommendation. Oh, there we go. Don't know what happened. Okay, yeah. So again, just to recap from before, running all the way back through the, I guess, flow of the interview, you get the prompt, you repeat it back to them, you ask for a minute to organize your thoughts, you then present your framework, so the structured way you're going to approach the problem, you'll work through it with the interviewer, and then you'll come to your conclusion and present your recommendations at the end. So with that being said, I know a lot of that was a lot of information, and so we want to give you all some resources that you can kind of go off of, and then open up for some questions. But some helpful books I think that are good resources are Case in Point, Crack the Case, and Case Interview Secrets. My personal favorite is Case Interview Secrets, but everyone, kind of has their own one. And I think it's helpful to read it to understand like the structure of a case interview and also build some basic business acumen. I did not know anything about business basically before reading any of these books, so I'd say they're definitely helpful. And then I would take a look at some of these websites below. The first 2 have some example cases, and you can also Google like a X business school or whatever, like Wharton casebook, and it'll come up online. You can download it and look at the cases in there. And then you can also look at cases from Bain, McKinsey, or BCG. They have some sample ones that you can take a look at that might be helpful to practice with. But yeah, I think that's the end of the presentation. So I think I'm going to stop sharing right now. And if anyone has any questions, love to answer them. You can put them in the chat. You could ask them either way. Or if you have to leave, totally understand.
And while you're thinking of your questions, just a couple of things. Definitely do not wait until the night before your interview to start practicing this. So somebody in the chat started a case prep group me, so please join that. Also, Javi and Ali do have one-on-one appointments available. So if you want to meet with them one-on-one, you can make an appointment on Handshake. It's when you go to Handshake, you make an industry appointment, and then it's case interview. It's peer advising dash consulting. So peer advising dash consulting is the appointment type. And then finally, this session is recorded, and it will be on our website by Friday. So if you want to rewatch it and pause and process some of the information, feel free to do that. It's I just put the link in the chat. And Dajoran, I see you have a question, so I'm going to stop talking now.
Hi, well, thank you for all of the information. All of it was very insightful. I had two quick questions, and I'll be brief with them. The first one is about, I don't know if any of this does exist, but to what extent across like various consulting firms, if you guys have any inquiry about this, does disability accommodations work into the interviews, if that's a thing? And then the second question is more so regarding the ways in which like so I see a lot of this is like regarding like quantitative use of numbers and explaining the ways in which like the numbers would work out, whether it be with profit, expenditures, or just anything regarding that. But I'm also wondering the extent to which qualitative research is also valuable, and to what extent would interviewers value either qualitative over quantitative, or vice versa, if both questions make sense. I could also rephrase if they don't make sense.
Yeah, they totally make sense. The first question with regard to disability accommodations, I am not super well versed in that. I would say you should reach out to the recruiter on like usually if you Google like Georgetown recruiter for like any X company or whatever, they'll have a specific person and you can reach out to them because I'm sure that they do have some accommodations for that. Although maybe Rebecca, if you know anything more about that.
If you when you're setting up the interview, you'll be working with a specific person at the company, so you can let them know what accommodations you need. If you are having trouble finding that person, like if you're just getting emails from info@company.com, reach out to us here at the Career Center, and we can walk you through the process of getting you accommodations for those firms.
Yeah. And then your second question was about qualitative information. Yeah, they do definitely focus on math, but they also have qualitative portions, and they have some parts of the interview where they might ask you like some brainstorming questions. So they might say like, okay, like you mentioned X solution, like you want to increase like the volume of sales. So like what ideas you have for how we might go about doing that. And then that's an opportunity for you to just like kind of spout some ideas off. So there is definitely a qualitative portion as well. Anyone else? Yes.
Can I just
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, hi. So I wonder what resources for case interview are at Colley?
So
go ahead.
Okay, so right now, Javi and Ali are your main go-to points for in-person assistance. I can help as well. I will admit that we are in between staff advisors right now. Julia, she was our advisor. She's moved over to a different team within our Career Center. And but we do have somebody who has worked at Deloitte and knows case inside and out, and he's starting on September 20th. So until then, Ali and Javier are your go-to folks. And then after the 20th, we will have a staff person as well. Javi and Ali will stay with us for a bit. And then as far as online, if you go to our website, let me just find it real quick and I'll drop the link in the chat. Give me 1 second. We do have some, most of the resources are the resources that Ali already mentioned. Let's see.
Sorry, really quickly.
Yeah,
while you're
go
looking
ahead.
at that, the other thing I would add is that we have student industry ambassadors also in Colley, and they're volunteer. And you can find them on, like, if you go to the Colley page, and I think if you look for resources and student industry ambassadors, there's definitely like at least 3 or 4 other people who work in consulting, and you can reach out to them over email, or there's going to be an email sent out soon to everyone with drop-in hours, and you can definitely like hit any of those people up, and they'd be happy to case you or talk you through any of this stuff as well.
Yeah, so I actually tried on the website, but the next available appointment is like 2 weeks away. So I'm not sure how that would work with my timeline. And also I wonder if the resources are mostly in the form of mock interviews.
You can email them. Also, Javi and I have appointments like in the next week or so you could sign up for one of those. The resources would be, if you're talking to them, you could ask for advice, or they could give you a mock interview. But there's also, do we have case books on the Colley website? I don't totally remember.
You just recommend the case books and then the same ones that you had on your slide. But when you go to, for an appointment, when you go into Handshake, if you go to industry advising, and then there's peer career advising -- consulting, that's the path that you want to follow. And Javi, I know, has appointments tomorrow. So there are definitely some more available.
I'm about to send something in the chat. Also, that's like it's like a website that has a bunch of case books, and I used a lot of these case books to prep. And usually a lot of like consulting clubs at MBA programs or from undergrad programs put them out just like on the internet, and you can download them, and they have a bunch of example cases. And it's helpful to read through them to understand like what the flow of a case is and like what they're looking for.
And don't forget about YouTube. There are some of the firms, like LEK has a really good YouTube channel with different like they show people walking through cases. So you see the conversation back and forth. McKinsey, Bain, BCG, and LEK all have some videos on YouTube as well if you want to watch people doing cases. Bakita, you have a question?
Hi, yeah, I have 2 questions. First, I'm wondering how this process differs for more, say, nonprofit or government or philanthropic-based organizations, consulting organizations, say, for example, Dahlberg or Bridgespan. In terms of case preparation, how does that usually work? And are there different sort of case preparation methods? And my second question is, in terms of resources for students who are interested in more nonprofit consulting, are there going to be, say, resources sent out, or is there a specific advisor that we could contact to sort of get to know what sort of opportunities there are out there in terms of in the consulting field?
So I would say, so first of all, if you're doing an interview with an organization that does nonprofit consulting, there's a chance you may not even be doing case interviews. So definitely ask the recruiter or the interviewer if you'll be doing a case interview. But if you do, the case prompt will be focused on a nonprofit organization or a social impact problem, depending on what it is that the firm focuses on. And as for resources, there is a site. It's are you looking specifically for the companies that might do government or nonprofit consulting?
Yes.
Okay, so most of, especially the ones that are coming to the career fair tomorrow night, most of them, and especially those in the DC area, will do government consulting. There's also a link, and let me get it here, for social impact consulting firms. Let me just find it here. I was sharing it the other day. And then Javi and Ali, if you want to jump in with any advice while I'm looking for this link.
I would say I know some consulting firms that do government and public sector stuff like Deloitte, but then also Bridgespan sometimes I think does still do cases. Deloitte has nonprofit style cases on its website, and so does Bridgespan. And if you just Google like nonprofit cases, they'll come up. But yeah, I would say like I honestly feel like prepping in this style is still really helpful if you have a case interview, because the structure is largely the same. So yeah, and then I would just practice with those nonprofit style cases.
And I'll try to find some more links with the company names. The ones that I just put in the link are kind of the big names. And very often the practices within the bigger firms, the social impact practices are much smaller. So sometimes you have to start in the government services or government consulting first, and then move over into more social impact if that is of interest to you. Chloe.
Hi, just a general question because I've never done this before. How much time do you typically have from when you hear that you get an interview until the actual interview? Or like if it's a couple days, do you recommend prepping just in case you get an interview kind of thing?
I would start now. I feel like the typical turnaround after the deadline is somewhere between a week to 2 weeks after, but more on the side of a week. So I would definitely start now.
And there is also a trend of some firms of doing the case interview before the behavioral interview. Sometimes you don't even get a chance to do the behavioral interview first. So definitely start practicing now. And what I'll do is I'll send a note out to this particular group that has signed up for this session and make some space for some interview practice, and just set up some space if you want to come in and do that.
And in terms of, how many cases should I do? Right? For some folks, it's 10, for some folks, it's 20, some folks, it's 40. The most important answer is just make sure that you feel comfortable. You figured out what your style is. And that, no matter like what curveballs thrown at you, that you're ready for it. Casing with as many people as possible is definitely something I would recommend. It's much better to case 2 or 3 times with 5 different people than it is to do 10 with one person. Exposing yourself to different styles of casing will help you build and figure out what style is best for you, especially if you're new to consulting and case interviewing.
Did you join?
Yeah, sorry, I have one more quick question actually. So I know it's not as well, I can't say I don't know, but I guess like with a major such as like sociology and African American studies, I'm thinking about ways in which like it's common for people to go to, I guess, not use their major to like help in a case, but more so how do you incorporate skills from your own background into, I guess, or how do you like properly incorporate skills from your own background and your own studies and authentically incorporate that into a case or just like within an approach or a framework? Because I know there's typical of just like the ways in which you guys described, or just like that autonomy to create your own framework. But I'm wondering how you authentically like use from your own background, if possible, to actually like situate with a scenario or case.
I think with a major like sociology, behavioral economics, right? Just being able to talk about like how your particular like academic or like professional background helps you think about business, right? Like how do you connect sociology with business? Questions like, why do people buy X product over Y product, right? How often are they buying something? How are they influenced by fads, by popularity, by celebrities, whatever it may be, right? Everyone's got their niche. So just figure out like what exactly like is your like value add, what helps you stand out. And that like, forget about consulting, just think about like what has your major taught you about people, about business, how can you connect the two? And I'm sure like sociology, you've got a lot of opportunities there to think about that.
It also, so I was a psychology major in college and then went into consulting, and that how people think, to Javi's point, really helps you with any sort of purchasing decisions, also helps you with groupthink, and why people make those particular decisions. And if you've ever taken an economics class, the foundation is that people are rational and make rational decisions. But any sort of sociology class, psychology class, will tell you that people are not rational. So just having that sort of the two sides of the same coin view is really helpful when you're in consulting in general.
To like your behavioral interviews as well. When you're asked like, why consulting? You can say X background academics, is something unique that I have that brings you into consulting, right?
Okay, so for those of you still on, I'm going to send out some resources, including the link to this video, once we're done here, and I'll set up some time for and space for some case practice, and I'll also let you know that as well. All right, thank you, Javi. Thank you, Ali. I really appreciate your time. And for the few folks still on, have a great evening, and hopefully we'll see you here soon.